In November 1987, a young family in Ena, Illinois was getting ready to leave town. They had a young son, another baby on the way, and plans to move closer to family. But before they could start over, something happened inside their mobile home that would leave behind a mystery that still haunts those who loved them. There was no obvious motive, no clear suspect, and no explanation that has ever fully fit. This is the story of the Dardeen family murders. Hello friends, my name is Marcia, and this is Midwest Murders, where we explore the unsolved cases that still haunt America. Jefferson County sits in southern Illinois, which in the 1980s was still very much rural. Flat land that stretches out in every direction, fields that go quiet in November, a sky that feels bigger than it should. Ena itself was small, quiet, just 400 people, one stoplight, a handful of businesses. The kind of place where doors weren't always locked at night because for most of its history, people didn't feel like they needed to be. But by the late 1980s, that sense of security had started to shift. Not all at once, but enough that people noticed. In the 2 years leading up to the murders, Jefferson County saw a rise in violent crime, 15 homicides. In a bigger city, that number might not stand out. In a place like this, it did. Keith and Elaine Dardeen had moved to Ena the year before. Keith was 29, working at a local water treatment plant. Elaine was 30, a part-time secretary at the Davenport Office Supply Company in Mount Vernon. They were active in their church. Keith sang. Elaine played piano. They had a 3-year-old son, Peter, and by the fall of 1987, Elaine was 7 months pregnant with their second child. They had already picked out names. Ian if it was a boy, and Casey if it was a girl. They were doing what young families do when they believe they have time. Building a life, one ordinary decision at a time. But beneath all of that normalcy, Keith seemed to sense something he could not quite name. His family would later describe a man who had grown cautious in ways he hadn't been before. Not paranoid, just careful. There was one night when a young woman came to their door asking to use the phone. Keith didn't let her in, not because he thought she was dangerous, but because he didn't feel comfortable opening the door to strangers. By late 1987, Keith and Elaine had made a decision. They were leaving Ena. They were moving back to Mount Carmel, back toward family, toward familiar ground. With 15 murders casting a shadow over the county, Keith's caution wasn't paranoia. It was a survival instinct. He wasn't just feeling something was wrong. He was watching his community change, and he was determined to get his family out. Their mobile home was put up for sale, and they started preparing to move. Then, everything changed. On the evening of November 17, 1987, Keith didn't show up for his 11 p.m. shift. That alone raised concern. He didn't miss work. He was always early, never late. Concerned, his supervisor called the house. Then he called again. Throughout the night and into the next morning, the phone in the Dardeen home rang out into an empty room. Becoming more and more alarmed, he finally contacted Keith's father, who drove to his ex-wife's home in Mount Carmel, but neither of them had heard a word. By that evening, Keith's mother, Joanne, knew something was very wrong. The family had last heard from Elaine the night before when she had called to say they had made it home safely after visiting relatives in Mount Carmel. At 5:30 p.m., Joanne contacted authorities and asked deputies to meet Keith's father at the couple's home. When Keith's father and the deputies entered the trailer, they didn't find chaos. They found something much harder to understand. Elaine and 3-year-old Peter were arranged together in a single bed. With them was baby Casey. She had been born prematurely in the midst of the attack. They had all been beaten to death. The home was immaculate. Nothing was taken. There was no sign of forced entry. Even now, it's difficult to fully process, not because of what happened, but because of what the scene suggested about the time, vulnerability, and helplessness of those inside that home. Keith was missing. His car was gone, too. At that point, investigators had to consider the possibility that Keith was involved. It was the most immediate explanation. His family was dead and he was gone. But that didn't sit right with everyone. His mother was certain that wasn't possible. And the next day, that theory began to fall apart. Just before sunset, hunters discovered Keith's body alongside the road just south of Rend Lake College, about a mile from the trailer. He had been shot multiple times. He hadn't run. He'd been taken and killed, which meant whoever was responsible had moved between two locations. And that raises a different kind of question. Not just who did this, but why. Later that same day, Keith's car was found. Modern retelling of the crime often claims the killer brazenly left Keith's car parked outside the police station, but the record tells a different story. The red 1981 Plymouth was found abandoned in a bank parking lot near the downtown square in Benton, roughly 15 miles south of the Dardeen home. In plain view, not hidden in a remote area. And inside, the car was covered in blood. This led police to speculate that Keith was dead or near dead when he was transported in the car from his home to where his body was found. The car was towed to the Benton police station and then on to the state crime lab for processing. Investigators were left with a case that was, in many ways, defined by what wasn't there. Nothing about Keith and Elaine suggested a motive. There were no signs of robbery, no evidence of financial trouble, no affairs, no drug connections, nothing that gave investigators a clear direction. Just a shaken community trying to make sense of something that seemed senseless. And when explanations don't come easily, theories fill the space. Some people believed it was personal, a targeted attack on Keith or Elaine specifically. Others floated the possibility of mistaken identity. This was the late 1980s, and Jefferson County had seen enough violence that the idea of a killer moving through the region didn't seem impossible. There was also the satanic panic theory. The late 1980s were also the peak of what historians now call a period of genuine mass hysteria, where communities across the country were interpreting certain crimes through that lens. Investigators and specialists look for the kinds of details that might support that idea, symbols, repeated patterns, or other elements pointing in that direction. None of that was documented here. The theory seems to have been born of fear and of a moment in time, not of evidence. But it speaks to how desperate people were for an explanation, any explanation. Years later, a name came up that investigators had to take seriously: Tommy Lynn Sells, a transient serial killer who confessed to dozens of murders across multiple states. He claimed responsibility for the Dardeen killings. The problem with Tommy Lynn Sells is the same problem investigators have always had with him. The confessions weren't reliable. Some details were accurate and others were just wrong. When pressed on specifics that had never been made public, details that only the actual killer would know, he struggled. The confession didn't close the case, it just added another layer. What police couldn't rule out was the location. The Dardeen home sat less than a mile from Interstate 57, which at that time was a main line for drug trafficking. Police noted the ease with which criminals could travel the interstate, hit a nearby community, and be hundreds of miles down the road before the crime was ever discovered. It meant the pool of potential suspects wasn't limited to Jefferson County. It could have been anybody passing through. Still, without stronger evidence, the interstate theory remains just that, a possibility investigators had to consider, not an answer. Fear and unease spread throughout the small community. Many thought a killer was among them. Night shift workers worried about leaving their families. Trust between neighbors eroded. Although their hospitable small-town habits remained, residents started exercising more caution. The uncertainty as to why 4 members of a family could be brutally murdered led several to purchase guns. Others admitted to saying quick prayers before opening their door to strangers. Hundreds of family and friends filled the chapel and adjoining parlors of the Short Conningham Funeral Home in Mount Carmel to say goodbye to Keith, Elaine, and their 2 children. The family was laid to rest in the Graceland Cemetery in Albion. Over time, the case faded from public conversation. People moved away, others passed on. New families came into the area, many of them never having heard the story at all. But for the people who remember it, it never really left. Because cases like this don't just disappear. They linger. Not just because of what happened, but because of what never made sense. So here's the question I keep coming back to, the one I think that is at the heart of why this case has never been solved, or at least never publicly been resolved. For years, the prevailing question in this case has been, who did Keith let in? And I understand why. There were no signs of forced entry, and Keith was cautious. He did not seem like a man who would simply open the door to anyone. But I'm not sure that question goes far enough. Because no forced entry does not necessarily mean that Keith opened the door. It only means the door was not broken open. We don't know the exact moment the attack began. We don't know whether Keith was inside the trailer, outside, getting ready to leave for his overnight shift. What if he was confronted or ambushed as he walked out to his car as he was getting ready to leave for work? And if Elaine heard something outside, would she have gone to the door? Would she have stepped out to see what was wrong? Or could someone have come to the door and said that something had happened to Keith? If a stranger knocked and claimed that Keith was hurt or needed help, Elaine may not have seen that as a threat. She may have opened the door because any concerned wife would. That possibility changes the question. Maybe it's not, who did Keith let in? Maybe it's, how did the killer get control before anyone inside the home understood the danger? And that's what makes this case so difficult. Every theory depends on a moment we can't see. A knock at the door, a sound outside, a familiar face, a believable lie. Some small point of access that turned an ordinary November night into something no one would ever forget. I don't have the answer, and that question is the one that makes this case impossible to forget. November in southern Illinois has a particular quality to it. There's a stillness to the landscape that isn't peaceful. It's just empty. Keith's body was found a mile away from the home where his family lay. I keep thinking about that mile, about the time it took to travel it, and the darkness that filled that space. The Dardeens weren't living on the edge. They were doing what people are supposed to do. Working, raising a family, preparing for the future. And in a matter of hours, all that was taken from them. No one has ever been held responsible, and that's the part that stays with you. If you have any thoughts or theories about this case, I'd love to hear them. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and may the truth reveal itself in the shadows.